So now we talked about tourism policy, but now we want to direct our attention to risk management and tourism. So this section will really cover over informed sustainable development as well as Sendai's framework and even the post-conflict tourism recovery. So when we think about disasters, we normally try to think about natural disasters as well, primarily, especially if we're talking about tourism. So I put in here a couple of images. So we have the wildfire type of disasters, flooding disasters, even earthquake and tornado disasters. But disaster varies of all kinds, especially when we're talking about different countries. We also get into the political aspect of things. You know, how is the political situation impacting the tourism in general? So that is something that we're gonna touch about here in just a little. So the World Economic Forum listed that there are 5 primary categories of risk. They are economic, environmental, societal, geopolitical, that I mentioned, technological. So right now, I want you guys to talk amongst each other. So the question is, which category of risk would you say is our current risk? So current as in like this year, 2023, and why? So I'll go ahead and let you guys pause this video and see, and talk amongst each other. So the World Economic Forum's listed that our current risk for this year in 2023 is the energy supply crisis, is cost of living crisis, rising inflation, food supply crisis, as well as cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. So these types of risk are more on the societal. If you see here, the energy supply, cost of living, food supply crisis. So they tend to be more on the societal, with the exception of cyber attacks that is more on the technological ends of things. So again, this is just something that they say is our risk here currently in 2023. But they also went ahead and said that we should estimate, our risk or likely impacts for the upcoming years within 2-year span as well as a 10-year span. So for the upcoming years, within 2 years, we see that there's a little bit more of a variety of concerns. So we have some societal concerns as the cost of living, as well as the large-scale involuntary migration. We also see some geopolitical ones with the geoeconomic confrontation. Environmental one with the failure to mitigate climate change, as well as failure to climate change adaptation. As for the 10-year span, we see that it's more green, so it's more environmental concerns that they are predicting within 10 years. Again, failure to mitigate climate change, natural disasters and extreme weather events, large-scale environmental damage incidents. One of the things that stood out for me was that there is no blue at all on this, so meaning that they're estimating that there is no economic concerns, whereas if you look back onto the our current situation, we do have disruption in the global supply chains for non-food goods, debt crisis. I mean, definitely that's something that's at least here in the US that we have high concerns about. So then we go on to talk about the Sendai framework. So the Sendai framework was more invented first in the 1970s. However, it's more so on the framework and how the adaptation within the 2015 year to far in the future now in 2030. So Sendai framework has 7 goals. It touched more on the substantial reductions first. So it's reducing global disaster mortality, reduce the number of affected people globally, reduce direct economic loss in relation to GDP, reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Now, we also look at the substantial increases of the goals, which is to increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, substantially enhance international cooperation to developing countries, as well as to increase the availability of the access to multi-hazard early warning systems. So that is just a gist of what the Sendai framework is. So we also go off to, we'll talk about the risk-informed sustainable development. So this not only touch base on the Sendai framework, but it introduces the Agenda for Sustainable Development for 2030, as well as the Paris Agreement, New Urban Agenda, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, so the AAAA, and then the Agenda for Humanity. So we see in this chart right here, it talks mainly about resilience as well as prevention. All of these that are mentioned here are included. So the goal is really to reduce mortality, people who are affected by the crisis, economic loss, infrastructure damage, as well as basic services disruption. So reduce all of this as well as increase cooperation, access to risk information/warnings, disaster risk reduction strategies, and risk assessment. So we already talked about the Sendai framework, so we're now going to talk about the 2023 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which says that the goal for this is to aim to go further towards ending all forms of poverty and promoting prosperity. So peace and partnerships while protecting the planet. The Paris Agreement touched base more on the need to address loss and damage associated with the effects of climate change. And then the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So this is a global framework for financing sustainable development efforts post-2015. Innovative financing mechanism that allow countries to better prevent and manage risk. So all of this that I've mentioned have been adapted after the Sendai's framework, as there was an earthquake in Nepal that struck in 2015. So the framework for the Sendai was briefly touched, but it wasn't really more put into practice. So this earthquake really really made us consider all types of options and brought into action more of these agendas and so on and so forth. So we have the New Urban Agenda as well. So this calls for sustainable management of natural resources in cities to promote DRR, which is the disaster risk reduction, by developing disaster risk reduction strategies and assessing disaster risk periodically. So we also have the Agenda for Humanity. This is reduction of risk and vulnerability on the global scale. So we already talked about the Sendai framework as well as the risk-informed sustainable development. So now we're going to move on to the third part of this, which is the post-conflict tourism recovery. So one strategy that was introduced was the Yokohama strategy. So the Yokohama strategy is basically some guidelines for natural disaster prevention. So it's a preparedness for preparedness and mitigation. So Yokohama strategy, some principles mentioned were that the risk assessment is a required step. Disaster prevention and preparedness reduce the need for disaster relief, as well as disaster prevention and preparedness are integral aspects of development policy and planning. So it has a list from 10. I mean, even considering the most important one, in my opinion, which is that each country bears the primary responsibility for protecting its people infrastructure and other national assets from the impact of natural disasters. So this also goes back to a little bit more on the geopolitical aspects of things as well. So not geopolitical, sorry, political. So we mentioned already that some disasters are caused by effects of the political situation. So often some tourists tend to be in other countries when, things happen. Like, for example, people who went to China or were in other parts of the country when the COVID-19 struck. So that's not much more of a political end, but that's just some situation where it tends to cross the political end, because then it determines like what do you have to do based on the countries. But there are other times where war happens. So the country that one is in goes in state of emergency. So then that's where, decision has to be made. But aside from the Yokohama strategy, there are different approaches to post conflicts. So there's like about the conventional approach. So this is relief-centric approach. It includes post-disaster works of response and recovery. And the text also touch base on comprehensive approach. So these are complete approach for management of disaster. It helps reduce the risk to any community of emergencies and disaster, but also focuses on capacity building and risk reduction for community. So all to say is that it's more on considering the prevention, the preparedness, the response, and the reconstruction of it all. So really just once a disaster occurs, so what is the action taking immediately towards that? All right. And I believe that is the end of my section.